On the evening of October 20th, 1986, a babysitter named Jennifer Caldwell arrived at a modest two-story colonial house on Maple Ridge Drive in Baltimore, Maryland, expecting to watch two children for what their mother described as a quick evening appointment that shouldn't run past 9 o'clock. Lavra Mitchell greeted her at the door with a smile that Jennifer would later describe to FBI investigators as strained, almost rehearsed, lacking the casual warmth of their previous interactions. Lavra handed her a list of phone numbers, pediatrician, neighbor, pizza delivery, and provided instructions for bedtime routines with the kind of excessive detail that suggested anxiety about a longer absence than she had indicated. 7-year-old Sarah was already in her pajamas, sitting on the living room carpet with a coloring book spread before her, while 4-year-old Jacob played with wooden blocks nearby, building and destroying towers with the methodical repetition typical of his age. Lavra kissed each child on the forehead, told them to be good for Jennifer, and walked out to her silver Honda Accord parked in the driveway. She drove away at 6:47 p.m., heading east on Maple Ridge toward the interstate. She never returned. The children waited for their mother that night, and the next morning, and the day after that. Jennifer Caldwell stayed with them, increasingly alarmed, calling the numbers Lavra had provided and finding no answers, no explanations. Lavra Mitchell had simply vanished, leaving behind two children, a husband who was traveling on business and unreachable, and a house full of ordinary possessions that suggested a life interrupted mid-sentence: breakfast dishes in the sink, laundry folded on the couch, a grocery list magnetized to the refrigerator. What Jennifer Caldwell did not know, what the children did not know, what even Laura's husband Mark did not know, was that the woman who had driven away that October evening was not Laura Mitchell at all. She was Irina Vasilievna Orlova, a deep-cover KGB illegal who had lived under false identity for 10 years. And she was executing an emergency extraction protocol that would take her back to the Soviet Union within 72 hours. The story of how Irina Orlova became Lavra Mitchell begins not in Baltimore, but in Novosibirsk, a Soviet industrial city in western Siberia, where she was born in 1949 to a family of committed Communist Party members. Her father worked as an engineer in a state-owned manufacturing plant. Her mother taught political theory at a technical institute. Irina grew up in an environment of ideological certainty, attending youth programs where loyalty to the Soviet state was cultivated, as the highest virtue where service to the motherland was presented not as a choice, but as an obligation encoded in the fabric of citizenship. She excelled academically, demonstrating particular aptitude for languages mastering, English with near-native fluency by her late teens, and showing the kind of disciplined, compartmentalized personality that KGB recruiters recognized as ideal for deep-cover work. In 1972, at age 23, she was recruited by Directorate S of the KGB, the division responsible for managing illegals intelligence officers who would be inserted into foreign countries under completely fabricated identities, living for years or even decades without diplomatic cover, building ordinary lives that concealed extraordinary purposes. The training that followed was comprehensive and psychologically demanding. Irina spent 4 years learning not just tradecraft dead drops, brush passes, cipher systems, surveillance detection, but also the cultural minutiae that would allow her to pass as a North American native. She studied Canadian regional dialects, memorized the geography of cities she had never visited, learned to cook Western foods, absorbed popular culture references, practiced the casual social interactions that defined middle-class life in capitalist societies. She was taught to build a legend of false identity so thoroughly constructed that it became a second self, complete with manufactured memories, fabricated childhood details, and a plausible personal history that could withstand routine background checks. In 1976, Irina Orlova entered Canada under the forged identity of Laura Mendez, carrying documents that identified her as a 27-year-old. woman born in Montreal to parents who had died in a car accident when she was young, leaving her to be raised by an elderly aunt who had subsequently passed away, creating a biographical narrative deliberately designed to explain the absence of family connections or childhood friends who might contradict her story. She spent 2 years in Toronto, working unremarkable jobs: retail clerk, restaurant hostess, administrative assistant, establishing employment history, and building the mundane documentation of ordinary existence. In 1978, she crossed into the United States and settled in Baltimore, where she met Mark Mitchell at a community college evening class on computer programming. Mark was 32 years old, an aerospace technician working for Northern Applied Systems, a defense contractor specializing in propulsion research for Air Force applications. He was divorced, socially awkward, intellectually focused, and lonely, exactly the kind of target that KGB planners had trained Irina to identify and cultivate. Their courtship followed a script that Irina had rehearsed in training. She presented herself as similarly isolated, a woman with no family connections and few friends, someone seeking stability and connection. They married in April 1978, a small civil ceremony with no relatives present on either side. Laura Mendez became Laura Mitchell. The legend was complete. For the first several years of their marriage, Irina's primary function was simply to exist, to build the deep cover that would eventually provide access to valuable intelligence. She worked part-time jobs that generated no particular scrutiny, maintained a low profile in the community, and gradually established herself as precisely the kind of unremarkable suburban wife who attracted no attention whatsoever. She gave birth to Sarah in 1979 and Jacob in 1982, bearing the children who would serve as additional elements of her cover, deepening the appearance of normalcy and commitment to American life. The pregnancies, the childcare, the parent-teacher conferences, the birthday parties, all of it was calculated performance, elements of a constructed identity that concealed her actual purpose. In 1979, using connections facilitated by her marriage to Mark, Irina obtained employment at Northern Applied Systems as an administrative coordinator in the procurement division, a position that granted her low-level security clearance and access to internal documentation regarding contract schedules, project timelines, and vendor relationships. The work itself was mundane: processing purchase orders, coordinating supplier communications, maintaining filing systems, but it positioned her within the information flow of a company conducting classified research on high temperature turbine materials, early cruise missile engine components, and noise reduction technology for long-range unmanned aerial vehicles. Even without access to top-secret technical specifications, the pattern she could observe, which projects received accelerated funding, which engineers were working extended hours, which materials were being ordered in unusual quantities, provided Soviet analysts with intelligence about American aerospace development priorities during a period when Cold War tensions were intensifying around the Strategic Defense Initiative and advanced weapon systems. Irina's tradecraft was deliberately low profile, designed to minimize risk of detection while maintaining steady intelligence flow to her KGB handlers. She never photographed documents or removed classified materials from the facility, understanding that such actions created evidence trails and triggered security protocols. Instead, she memorized project numbers, technical phrases, procurement patterns, and personnel discussions recording her observations as audio notes on a modified pocket dictation device that she kept hidden in her car, later transcribing the information into coded summaries that she passed through dead drops, positioned in locations around the Baltimore-Washington corridor. Her preferred dead drop method was elegant in its simplicity. She used the freezer sections of large grocery stores, placing micro-coated film behind removable price labels on frozen food packages that her handler could retrieve during routine shopping trips. The method exploited the high-traffic and casual surveillance environment of public retail spaces, where dozens of people handled products every hour and security cameras captured too much mundane activity to facilitate detailed analysis. Communication with her handler, a KGB officer named Sergei Antonov, who operated under diplomatic cover as a cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy in Kars, Washington, occurred through prearranged color patterns and classified advertisements placed in the Baltimore Sun newspaper. A specific combination of keywords and font choices in ads for used furniture or automobile sales would indicate which dead drop location was active, what priority level the material warranted, and when the next scheduled collection would occur. The system allowed them to coordinate exchanges without direct contact, minimizing exposure and creating plausible deniability if either party came under surveillance. For nearly 7 years, from 1979 through 1985, Irina maintained this carefully calibrated routine, passing low to moderate value intelligence while building ever deeper cover through her marriage, her children, and her reputation as an unremarkable suburban mother and part-time employee. She received payment through cash deliveries, carefully structured to avoid detection small increments, deposited over many months, amounts that could plausibly be attributed to part-time work or household savings. She intentionally maintained mediocre job performance, never seeking promotions or additional responsibilities that would increase her visibility or subject her to more rigorous security vetting. She participated in school functions, attended neighborhood gatherings, cultivated the appearance of a woman whose ambitions extended no further than raising her children and supporting her husband's career. And beneath this performance, known only to herself and her handlers in Moscow, she maintained absolute emotional discipline, never allowing attachment to interfere with operational security, never confusing her cover identity with her actual self. The children she raised were assets in her operation. The man she lived with was a target whose professional access justified her continued presence. The life she appeared to be living was tactical deception executed at the most intimate scale imaginable. But in 1986, the operational environment that had protected Irina for nearly a decade began to shift in ways that would ultimately force her extraction. The Reagan administration had intensified counterintelligence pressure on Soviet operations, expelling 25 Soviet diplomats suspected of intelligence work and tightening security protocols at defense contractors and government facilities. The FBI expanded its use of computer-assisted analysis to detect anomalies in employee behavior, implementing new software systems that tracked access patterns, file retrievals, and after-hours presence in ways that previous manual monitoring could not match. At Northern Applied Systems, routine security audits began identifying irregularities that had previously escaped notice. Employees whose building access timestamps showed unexplained late-night presence, whose file retrieval patterns suggested interest in projects outside their assigned responsibilities, whose behavioral profiles indicated stress markers or financial irregularities. In January 1986, Laura Mitchell's name appeared on a routine security review flagged by the new anomaly detection software. The irregularities were minor: a pattern of late-night building access that occurred with unusual frequency, file requests that occasionally crossed division boundaries, timestamps that suggested she remained in the facility after other administrative staff had departed. None of these details individually constituted evidence of espionage, but collectively they formed a pattern that warranted secondary review. The security office forwarded the findings to the FBI's Baltimore field office, where counterintelligence analysts added Laura Mitchell to a watch list of individuals requiring discreet investigation. The FBI surveillance that began in April 1986 was deliberately low intensity, designed to avoid alerting the target while gathering evidence about her activities and contacts. Special Agent Leonard Briggs, a 15-year veteran of Cold War counterintelligence operations, supervised a small team that included surveillance officer Teresa Randall, whose assignment was to conduct periodic observation of Laura Mitchell's movements outside the workplace without establishing continuous coverage that might be detected through counter-surveillance techniques. They used automated license plate cameras positioned at Northern Applied Systems to document her arrival and departure patterns. They conducted passive surveillance from unmarked vehicles positioned on routes between her home and workplace, rotating vehicles and operators to avoid pattern recognition. They reviewed her financial records, finding no obvious evidence of unexplained wealth, but noting a pattern of small cash deposits that lacked clear sourcing. They interviewed her coworkers under the guise of routine security reviews, asking carefully calibrated questions about her demeanor, her social relationships, her emotional state, seeking indicators of stress, financial pressure, or ideological motivation that might suggest vulnerability to foreign intelligence recruitment. What they found was a portrait of profound ordinariness, a quiet woman who performed her job adequately, but without distinction, who maintained minimal social connections, who spoke rarely about her childhood or family background, who seemed devoted to her children, but maintained an emotional reserve that colleagues described as slightly distant, slightly removed. Nothing in this profile definitively indicated espionage, but neither did it contradict the possibility. The investigation continued through the summer of 1986, patient and methodical, waiting for the definitive evidence that would justify arrest. That evidence materialized on September 3, 1986, at a farmer's market in Alexandria, Virginia. FBI surveillance teams had been monitoring known Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover in the Washington area, including Sergei Antonov, whose official duties as a cultural attaché provided thin cover for his actual role managing KGB assets in the region. On this particular Wednesday afternoon, Teresa Randall was conducting routine observation of Lara Mitchell's movements after she had taken a personal day off from work, ostensibly to run errands and attend to household matters. Randall followed Mitchell from Baltimore into Northern Virginia, maintaining distance while documenting her route and stops. At 2:17 p.m., Mitchell entered a farmer's market in Alexandria, a crowded open-air venue where dozens of vendors sold produce, baked goods, and crafts to afternoon shoppers. Randall positioned herself with clear sight lines to the entrance and began photographing the crowd with a long lens camera concealed in a shopping bag. At 2:34 p.m., Sergei Antonov entered the same farmer's market from the opposite entrance. FBI analysts would later determine that this timing was not coincidental, but carefully coordinated, both individuals arriving within a 17-minute window that allowed them to appear present simultaneously without arriving together. At 2:41 p.m., high-speed photographic sequences captured what counterintelligence officers call a brush pass. Lara Mitchell and Sergei Antonov moved through the crowd on converging paths, their shoulders making contact for approximately 2 seconds as they passed each other near a produce stand. The contact appeared accidental, the kind of incidental physical touch that occurs constantly in crowded public spaces. But frame-by-frame analysis of the photographs revealed a deliberate exchange. Mitchell's hand moving to her jacket pocket immediately after the contact, a subtle motion that suggested material transfer. The evidence was circumstantial, but highly suggestive. A known Soviet intelligence officer and a defense contractor employee under FBI surveillance had made physical contact in a crowded public venue using tradecraft consistent with covert communication methods. The investigation entered a new phase. FBI counterintelligence planners faced a strategic decision. They could arrest Lara Mitchell immediately, charging her with espionage based on the circumstantial evidence they had gathered, the access anomalies, the financial irregularities, the observed contact with a known Soviet officer. But such an arrest would yield only limited intelligence about the broader network, the extent of compromise, and the Soviet methods being employed. The preferred approach was to continue surveillance, waiting for additional contacts, hoping to identify other assets in the network and build a comprehensive understanding of the operation before making arrests that would inevitably cause the entire network to shut down. They decided to wait intensifying surveillance while preparing arrest warrants that could be executed on short notice if Mitchell showed signs of fleeing or destroying evidence. What they did not anticipate was that the KGB, operating its own surveillance detection protocols, had identified FBI interest in Mitchell before the FBI was ready to act. Soviet intelligence officers conducting counter-surveillance in the Washington area had observed patterns suggesting FBI presence near known Soviet contact points. They had detected anomalies in the electronic environment around certain dead drop locations, subtle indicators that suggested law enforcement monitoring. And in October 1986, KGB headquarters in Moscow made the decision to activate emergency extraction protocols for assets operating in the Washington-Baltimore corridor who might be under FBI scrutiny. The decision was driven not by certain knowledge that specific individuals had been compromised, but by the precautionary principle that defined Soviet intelligence operations during periods of heightened counterintelligence pressure. When doubt existed about an asset, security extraction was preferable to capture. On October 18, 1986, Irina Orlova received the signal that would terminate her decade-long operation and force her to abandon everything she had constructed. The signal came through a shortwave radio broadcast, a seemingly innocuous musical jingle inserted into a Russian language cultural program that transmitted on a frequency Irina had been instructed to monitor twice weekly throughout her time in the United States. The jingle's specific melody and timing constituted an emergency code that meant surveillance detected, extraction protocol activated, proceed to designated escape route within 48 hours. Irina had rehearsed this scenario countless times during her training, but the actual moment of receiving the signal produced cognitive dissonance that she would later describe to her KGB debriefers as unexpectedly disorienting. For 10 years, Laura Mitchell had been her identity. The performance had become so thorough, so deeply inhabited, that the sudden reversion to Irina Orlova required conscious psychological effort. She had 48 hours to extract herself from American territory, while leaving no evidence that would confirm her espionage activities or compromise other assets in the network. The escape protocol was precise. She would take no documents, no materials, nothing that could be forensically linked to intelligence work. She would create a cover story for her absence that bought maximum time before authorities began searching. She would follow a pre-established route that involved multiple transportation changes, crossing into international territory before FBI surveillance could intercept her. And she would leave behind everything: her home, her possessions, her husband, and her children. The decision to abandon Sarah and Jacob was not emotional, but operational. Taking the children would immediately confirm intelligence activity, triggering Amber Alerts and border interdictions that would make escape impossible. Leaving them behind created ambiguity. She could be characterized as a troubled woman who had abandoned her family, perhaps suffering mental health crisis, rather than as a fleeing intelligence operative. The children were 7 and 4 years old, young enough that their memories of her would fade, young enough that they could be raised by others without permanent psychological damage, or so the operational calculus suggested. Irina spent October 19th preparing the logistics of her departure, with the same disciplined focus she had brought to every aspect of her cover life. She called Jennifer Caldwell to arrange babysitting, scheduling the appointment for Monday evening and providing explanations that suggested a brief, routine absence. She packed no bags, took no suitcases, carried nothing that would indicate planned departure. On the evening of October 20th, she kissed her children goodbye, drove to Baltimore Washington International Airport, and used forged travel documents to board a flight to Chicago under a name that FBI systems would not immediately flag. From Chicago, she flew to Helsinki on a commercial carrier, arriving in Finland on October 21st and making contact with Soviet diplomatic personnel who facilitated her final transit to Moscow. By October 23, 1986, Irina Vasilyevna Orlova was back in the Soviet Union, undergoing debriefing at a KGB facility outside Moscow, while American authorities were still trying to determine whether Lavra Mitchell was a missing person or a fugitive intelligence operative. The FBI raid on the Mitchell residence occurred on October 24th, 4 days after Irina's departure, conducted by Special Agent Leonard Briggs and a tactical team equipped with warrants to search for evidence of espionage. They found a house that looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, the home of an ordinary suburban family, frozen mid-routine. Children's toys scattered across the living room floor, school artwork magnetized to the refrigerator, family photographs on the mantelpiece showing birthday parties and holiday gatherings, visual documentation of a life that appeared completely normal. But what they did not find was any evidence of intelligence activity. No cipher pads, no recording devices, no hidden documents, no communications equipment, no cash reserves beyond routine household savings. Irina had maintained perfect operational discipline, keeping no materials in her residence that could confirm espionage, relying entirely on memory and external dead-drop systems to pass intelligence. The FBI's technical teams dismantled the house systematically, pulling up floorboards, examining walls for hollow spaces, analyzing computers and telephones for hidden communications capacity. They found nothing. The investigation turned to Mark Mitchell, who had returned from his business trip to find his wife vanished, his children in the care of a confused babysitter, and FBI agents searching his home. The interrogations that followed were extensive and psychologically brutal. Agents questioned whether Mark had known about his wife's true identity, whether he had participated in her intelligence activities, whether his marriage was genuine or merely cover for a joint operation. Mark insisted that he had no knowledge of any espionage activity, that his wife had never displayed suspicious behavior, that he had believed completely in the authenticity of their relationship and their family. Polygraph examinations supported his claims. Background investigations found no evidence of Soviet connections or ideological sympathies. The FBI concluded that Mark Mitchell had been an unwitting asset, a target selected for his professional access and successfully manipulated through a relationship he believed was genuine. The damage assessment conducted in the months following Irina's escape revealed the sophistication of her operation and the significant intelligence loss her activities had caused. Analysis of Northern Applied Systems project records, cross-referenced against the timing of her access, showed that she had been positioned to observe critical developments in aerospace propulsion technology during a period when the United States was expanding capabilities for cruise missiles, unmanned aerial vehicles, and advanced turbine systems. The procurement patterns she had monitored, the project timelines she had documented, the technical discussions she had overheard. Collectively, these provided Soviet military analysts with insights into American research priorities, development schedules, and technological approaches that informed their own programs and countermeasures. The intelligence was not traumatic in the manner of stolen weapons blueprints or compromised nuclear codes, but it was strategically valuable, the kind of incremental advantage that shaped the technological competition between superpowers. The FBI's failure to capture Irina before her escape was classified as one of the most significant counterintelligence failures of the mid-1980s, prompting comprehensive reviews of security protocols at defense contractors and the implementation of new procedures for vetting employees with foreign-born spouses or unexplained gaps in family background. The case remained technically open, but practically unsolved. Another entry in the long catalog of Cold War espionage operations, where the truth was known, but justice was never achieved. For Mark Mitchell, the aftermath of his wife's disappearance and exposure as a Soviet intelligence operative produced psychological trauma from which he never fully recovered. The revelation that his marriage had been a calculated deception, that the woman he had loved and trusted for 8 years had been performing a role, that their children were elements of her cover rather than expressions of genuine family commitment. This knowledge, shattered his sense of reality in ways that extended far beyond the specific betrayal. He was cleared of involvement in espionage, but terminated from his position at Northern Applied Systems due to security concerns. His professional career effectively ended by association with an intelligence operation he had never known existed. He was hospitalized briefly for stress-related illness, suffering anxiety attacks and depressive episodes that required psychiatric intervention. His sister assumed primary responsibility for raising Sarah and Jacob, taking the children into her home, while Mark struggled to reconstruct his life and his identity. The children themselves were too young to fully understand what had happened. Sarah retained fragmented memories of her mother leaving that October evening, while Jacob's recollections were too vague to constitute coherent narrative. They were told simplified versions of the truth, as they grew older explanations that their mother had been someone other than who she claimed to be, that she had left for reasons having nothing to do with them, that they had been innocent participants in circumstances beyond their comprehension or control. The psychological impact of this abandonment manifested differently in each child. Sarah developed attachment difficulties and trust issues that persisted into adulthood, while Jacob constructed elaborate fantasy narratives about his mother's departure, inventing reasons and explanations that made the abandonment less arbitrary and more comprehensible. Neither child ever had contact with Irina again. The family never recovered from the fracture her departure created. In Moscow, Irina Vasilievna Orlova underwent 9 weeks of intensive debriefing at a KGB facility, where returning illegals were systematically questioned about every aspect of their operations, their intelligence production, their cover maintenance, and the circumstances of their extraction. She was commended for maintaining operational discipline under surveillance pressure, for executing emergency extraction protocols successfully, and for producing valuable intelligence over nearly a decade of deep cover work. She was assigned a new identity, Irina Lenova, and relocated to an apartment in a Moscow suburb where former illegals lived under KGB protection and supervision. She never attempted to contact her children. Whether this was operational discipline, personal choice, or psychological compartmentalization that prevented her from acknowledging emotional connection to individuals who had served primarily as elements of her cover remains unknown. In subsequent years, after the Soviet Union's collapse, her case was cited in FSB training materials as an example of successful deep cover operation and emergency extraction, a model of how illegals programs should function when properly executed. The assessment noted that only the implementation of new American computer-assisted anomaly detection systems had exposed vulnerabilities in her cover, and that she had successfully evaded capture despite FBI surveillance, demonstrating tradecraft discipline under pressure. The story of Irina Orlova is ultimately a story about the human cost of ideology and the moral complexity of intelligence work that operates at the intersection of intimate relationship and strategic deception. She spent 10 years living as someone else, building a family that was simultaneously real and false, raising children who were both her own and tools of her mission. The psychological compartmentalization required to maintain this dual existence, to perform authentic seeming love and care, while understanding that the performance was tactical, that the relationships were means rather than ends, represents a form of sustained deception that exceeds the operational challenges of traditional espionage. When she drove away that October evening, leaving her children with a babysitter and disappearing into extraction protocols that would take her back to Moscow, she was making a choice that no training could fully prepare her for. The choice to abandon individuals whose entire existence was entangled with her own, who called her mother and trusted her completely, who had no knowledge of the fiction in which they were living. The operational justification was clear: taking them would compromise escape, leaving them preserved security. But the moral dimension of that choice, the human cost measured not in classified documents or strategic advantage, but in the shattered trust of children who woke one morning to find their mother vanished extends beyond the categories of loyalty and betrayal that typically frame Cold War espionage narratives. Sarah and Jacob Mitchell grew up knowing that the first relationship of their lives, the foundational bond with their mother, had been performance rather than authentic connection. That knowledge shaped their development in ways that extended across decades, creating wounds that therapy and time could address but never fully heal. The Cold War produced thousands of such stories and individuals who lived double lives, who maintained deceptions over years or decades, who sacrificed relationships and identities for causes they believed transcended personal loyalty. Some, like Irina Orlova, escaped and returned to their true allegiances, living out their lives in the countries they had served. Others were captured, prosecuted, imprisoned for their betrayals. Still others were never discovered, their espionage remaining hidden, known only to themselves and the intelligence services that directed them. And in every case, the human wreckage extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Touching spouses who discovered their marriages were fiction, children who learned their parents were strangers, colleagues who realized trust had been weaponized against them. The strategic competition between superpowers required this kind of intimate deception, this exploitation of the most fundamental human bonds in service of geopolitical objectives. The question that haunts Irina Orlova's story is whether the intelligence she provided, the procurement patterns, the project timelines, the technical observations, justified the destruction she left behind. The Soviet Union that she served dissolved 5 years after her escape, rendering the cause she sacrificed her family for historically moot. The children she abandoned carried psychological scars into adulthood, their capacity for trust permanently damaged by the revelation that maternal love could be theatrical. The husband she manipulated never fully recovered his sense of reality or his professional standing. And Irina herself, living in Moscow under a new identity, remained forever the woman who had been. Lavra Mitchell, unable to escape the memory of a role she had performed so thoroughly that it became indistinguishable from a life actually lived. In the end, the cost of Cold War espionage cannot be calculated in stolen secrets or strategic advantages, but must be measured in the irreparable damage to human connection, the knowledge that the people we trust most completely may be the ones deceiving us most profoundly, and the terrible truth that sometimes the most effective lies are the ones we tell with our entire lives.